Hello everyone, this is Craig here, and on today's episode we are doing a wrap-up session of our reading group session of the Nomadology Plateau from 1,000 Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari. On the last day of April of 2022 and the first day of May 2022, we will continue our reading group by reading together the Plateau Apparatus of Capture. All of these reading group sessions essentially function as a standalone, but you can also get caught up with our previous reading group sessions if you become a patron for as little as $1. Pop in and watch some of the sessions that we have recorded earlier this year. Also in this episode, Adam references a blog post that he wrote about this particular plateau. That said, you can check out all of our blogs by following links in the show notes, and you can support us by simply becoming a patron or perhaps purchasing something from the merch store. On today's episode, we are joined by one of our patrons, Noah, with whom we will discuss Deleuze and Guattari's concept of nomadism. Okay, let's get started. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, we are conducting a wrap-up episode on the treatise on Nomadology in 1,000 Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari. And with us on the episode, we have Adam, we have Will, and we also have Noah, who is a Patreon supporter of ours and an active member of the reading group. How are you doing today, Noah?
I'm doing well. Happy to be here. Some dreams do come true, I guess.
Great. Well, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're doing academically, and how the work with Deleuze and Guattari is impacting your research areas?
For sure. I did debate in high school, so I was kind of thrown into philosophy. And it was always very, 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 very useful, right? I had to apply philosophy to a real world topic. And I got lucky and got into a good business school, not knowing really what I wanted to do here at the University of Texas. And I majored in finance. And so throughout learning finance, I was also trying to keep up with and relive the glory days of debate by reading Deleuze and Guattari and following people on Twitter and interacting and whatnot. And it became a sort of supplement maybe or aid to understanding how money works and how economies work and how violence works and what is political in finance. And so Deleuze and Guattari for me do a really good job with stuff like the war machine or with various critiques of finance or explaining or understanding global capitalism and its movements. And that for me has been crucial, not only for finance, but also reflecting back with my knowledge of finance onto understanding what their project is about.
Okay, so the first question that we want to address is, what do Deleuze and Guattari mean by nomad, nomadology, and war machine? So we're going to unpack those terms and interpolate some of the encounters that we've had in the text, and we'll let Adam go first on that.
So to start with the war machine, the war machine is a machine or a set of functions that breaks down unity. It's this is good, Comrade Violet, for giving me this phrase here. It's subtractive. It takes down the oneness of a certain ordered space by occupying it, and as Deleuze and Guattari call it, smoothing it out. It flattens walls. It moves through walls. It takes away the striations of property and delineated zones of action, and it doesn't look at space in the same way we would look at space in terms of the everyday, in terms of where we can and where we can't go to. The war machine doesn't look at it in terms of what it's allowed to do or what certain laws or orders prohibit it from doing, but in terms of what it can do with a space, how it can occupy it, and how it can make that space work for what it's trying to do, which is control territory, take territory away from its assigned meaning in peacetime, and make it into a space of contest in which it can contest over in order to create a supplement to the war machine itself, which is actual war. The condition of possibility for taking over a space and creating something new out of that space from the order that was previously there. Now, in terms of it being a nomadic war machine, the nomad isn't nomadic insofar as there's this essential fetishized character of stateless peoples throughout history. It's rather how they're situated in relation to space and to order and to how they look at space, and also in terms of how they move in relation to space, which detaches them from what we know as a state. Now, the Nomadology as a text is going to try and understand, through a lot of anthropological evidence based on certain traits of nomadic peoples, their proximity to certain crafts such as metallurgy, particularly their own sort of kinds of geographies and how they would create a geography and a cartography of space beyond a specific kind of position or a state-based position. And it's going to try and articulate a hidden part or a not quite explicated part of the state's relation, not only to the nomads, but to itself in terms of how it sees nomads or how nomads are exterior to the state and what a non-state society would tell us about an actual state society. And not only this, it would tell us how war is made by states insofar as the states have to appropriate this nomadic element of the war machine. The war for them is not internal to the state. The war has to appropriate these nomadic sort of forces of dissolution into itself in order to form a military institution. And this is borne out quite well historically in terms of the relative novelty, in terms of, especially in Europe, of standing armies. For example, in the Landsknechts in Germany, and sort of general mercenary-based warfare was the predominant kind of warfare for centuries, really, until the standing army would increase itself in line with the rise of national bourgeoisies and the need for them to compete each other in a constant phase of imperialist and economic warfare. So the nomadology, as an attempt at science, nomadic science, is overall an attempt to understand these forces and understand not only an externality to the state, and also a contrary way of thinking about space, about ordering, about occupying space, what you can do with a space or with the body of a territory, and to see what is left unacknowledged or unconscious in the face of our very habitual thinking in terms of state thinking and societal thinking.
Noah, how about you? What is your central focus or central definition of nomadism, the nomadology, and maybe you can even talk about how it relates to some of the work that you've done?
For me, the question is, extremely political, right? It is a historical one. It's a theological one of where does the state come from and how does it get powerful? And how does it use war and how does it use this thing called the war machine? And what came before the state? What is existing outside of the state, right? And these are questions that I think for me are important to understanding how things like money works or how flows of energy and people and resources happen, right? Through kinship groups, through different dynasties. And I think that their question or the way they phrase is the war machine that can be something that can be appropriated by the state. And I think that that's very fascinating because it means that it wasn't always in their hand or in their control. And for me, that makes me think of these non-state societies that they talk about, right? And how they're being pushing against the state. And the example of Moses, I think, is very salient that they bring up, is that they left the Egyptian state and they became nomads in the desert. And they were a nomadic group that inevitably had to turn to war. And they had to have a synthesis with Yahweh, as they put it in the book, that enabled them to become a group that overcame their fears of inferiority, etc., that let them sort of go on to become a powerful state right at the end after fighting all these things. And I think for me, nomadology, like Adam was saying, is an important way of looking at the flows of non-state thinking, of non-state fighting, of interacting with metal, even with the resources in the earth, right? And the different ways of looking at or experiencing or mining with materials. The machinic phylum, I think, this may be getting too far, but was something that towards the end is super interesting to me, that is a part of this nomadology, this way of thinking with resources, flowing through things, like flowing through the desert, and sort of this idea of movement and speed and just interacting with the world as part of what they're trying to explain, right? As like a sort of historical reasoning.
Now, Will, you weren't at the reading group. I think you were at some emo concert or something. I can't quite remember where you were, but I know you've encountered this text and you looked at it today. What are some big impressions that you had this time around?
Coming back to this text is always awesome because, like, I think obviously everything that Adam and Noah said are right on point, but I guess two things I'll point out in the text when it comes to answering what nomadology is or what the nomad opposes. I think one way to sort of pin this down is to look at the relationship between royal and nomad sciences, right? Which is going to be the difference between the royal sciences of classification and striating forces of royal science versus the nomad science of a sort of ancient Epicurean, Lucretian atomism that is going to be a question of the smallest possible movement that an atom can take, right? The clinamen is going to be a nomad science that opposes the royal, because it's a question of intensities, frequencies, and movement, and not a question of creating sort of an exhausted, striated model of classification. The opposition between Democritus being the subject of Aristotle's critique, or Plato, a better example, who invokes the atomist tradition only then to paper over it in Timaeus. For the war machine, though, I think that there's this fantastic example of the street gang in Bogota, the one that the very nature of the collection is the dispersion. The thing that they all share is the fact that they are dispersed. They all sleep in different places. They all move in different directions. And, any attempt to solidify this regime causes the absolute explosion of the group itself. So when it comes down to the war machine being the very thing that breaks bonds, the appropriation of the war machine becomes a timed impossibility, right? It can only happen for a particular period, right? Because the fundamental mode of operation for a war machine is the breaking up, diffusion of these spaces. Another good example would be, again, and this is from weeks and weeks ago now, the opposition between AlphaGo and chess, or Go and chess, where at any given point in chess, everything is segmented with particular predetermined roles and paths of movement, whereas Go, the battlefield is diffused. And any given node can reverse the entire field of pieces. So I think those are two, because I cling to examples for Deleuze and Guattari, but those are the two or three that speak out to me. The opposition between Nomad and Royal Sciences, the delinking or diffusion of nodes of hierarchical relation, and the nature of the diffuse battlefield, where there is a battle, but there's no distinct front line.
I thought the thing that I would bring to the table today was something not from the treatise on nomadology itself, but an essay that Deleuze had written, I think after Anti-Oedipus. I think it's written in 1973. I'll have to check. But the collection of essays in which it's found, I think it's found in a few different places, but the essay Nomad Thought, it's found within a compilation of essays edited by David Allison called The New Nietzsche. And interestingly, it was published before 1,000 Plateaus. So my guess is that he wrote this before writing with Guattari, the Nomadology plateau. But I think it's interesting to point out why and how Nietzsche becomes and stays a principal mediator throughout Deleuze's thought, and what Nietzsche's role is in constructing this idea of nomadism or a nomadology. And I'm actually going to read a couple excerpts from this. It's definitely worth having it on the recording. But the idea that Deleuze puts forward isn't very different from what Adam said about Violet with respect to what is a war machine, this subtractive force. Nietzsche is this figure in philosophy who marks the dawn of counterculture. Prior to Nietzsche, the movement of philosophy through modernity was about this incessant codification and recodification. But the way that Nietzsche asks us to think is in a way that decodes and continues to keep decoding. And the question is, why is this important? Here's what Deleuze says. Modern society clearly does not function on the basis of codes. Yet if we consider the evolution of Marxism or Freudianism, rather than taking Marx and Freud literally, we see that they are paradoxically launched in an attempt at recodification by the state in the case of Marxism. You have been made ill by the state and you will be cured by the state, but not the same state. And recodification by the family in the case of Freudianism. You've been made ill by the family and you'll be cured by the family, but not the same family. So Marxism and psychoanalysis, in a real sense, constitute the fundamental bureaucracies, one public, the other private, whose aim is to somehow or other to recodify everything that ceaselessly becomes decodified at the horizon of our culture. And this is important with respect to the philosophy, the political philosophy of accelerationism, where we see that section in Anti-Oedipus that's always hotly contested. What did Deleuze and Guattari mean when they cited Nietzsche as saying, the point is to accelerate the process further? We haven't seen anything yet. And there's a very nice passage that Deleuze has here. Confronted with the ways in which our societies become progressively decodified and unregulated, in which our codes break down at every point, Nietzsche is the only thinker who makes no attempt at recodification. So already we're seeing this notion of schizoanalysis kind of recast in another way. He says the process still has not gone far enough. We are still only children. And the quote from Nietzsche goes like this: "The emancipation of the European man is the great irreversible process of present day, and the tendency should be even accelerated." In his own writing and thought, Nietzsche assists in the attempt at decodification, not in the relative sense, by deciphering former, present, or future codes, but in an absolute sense, by expressing something that cannot be codified, confounding all codes. And the way that this relates to the idea of the image of thought, as we might understand it in places in Deleuze's work, like difference and repetition, is to see that even our way of reading Nietzsche should be nomadic in some sense. And I think Deleuze's defense and vindication of Nietzsche goes precisely like this. The perennial debate is, how do we cherry pick Nietzsche and find out how can we use Nietzsche for his politics? How can we sort of reassemble those components? And at one time, I even thought, okay, maybe that's the way to do it. But there's something more going on here. And I put this on Twitter. I think this is yet another passage just worth reading out loud. The revolutionary character of Nietzsche's thought becomes apparent at every level of method. It is his method that makes Nietzsche's text into something not to be characterized in itself as fascist, bourgeois, or revolutionary, but to be regarded as an exterior field where fascist, bourgeois, and revolutionary forces meet head-on. And I think that line there is what connects most closely to the understanding of nomadology as we fleshed it out in our reading group. How is it that we can use language, writing, a book, a film, a relationship, a city, in any sort of way that forces us to get out a representational mode of thinking and put us in a place that kind of puts us at risk politically, right? It kind of overcomes these sort of binary distinctions between revolutionary and reactionary. But to know that the new is created by some other force than the representational. And that if we allow ourselves to be taken into this sort of exterior construction that Deleuze talks about by virtue of Nietzsche, well, then we can find lines of flight that are enlivening, that offer the prospects of a new kind of revolutionary movement, and not simply one that retroactively and regressively attempts to recodify the kinds of political force that existed before modernity as a way to escape from capitalism. And here's where I go to Noah, where you brought up the idea of the machinic phylum. One of the things that they suggest in Anti-Oedipus is we are fully implicated and imbricated within this movement of the axiomatic of capital. In line with the sort of accelerationist tendency, how are we to understand a future politics seeing ourselves somehow outside of capital? We're already in the soup, as it were. And I think, when we look at what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do in Anti-Oedipus, and this use of Nietzsche here, is to be able to develop a sensibility. They articulate this notion of schizoanalysis, to see the present moment within the milieu of capitalism within which we exist, that we can move forward and not make these sort of regressive steps back into politics that they see as always already arriving as a kind of failure, principally because they have failed in the past.
You're asking a question that I can rephrase maybe in a way that's the question maybe I'm hearing is, how can we create a new war machine? And do we become nomads maybe? Are we trying to become anti-state per se? Or are they, is this sort of a thing like a rhizomatic versus arborescent way of thinking? One is not necessarily bad or better than the other, right? But they do different things and they flow in different ways. And so my problem, I'm reading Lazzarato, right, with, him explaining the new war machine being finance or being global capitalism's tools and weapons of monetary policy, of institutional banks, of microfinance and things of this nature, and how that creates war and how that devastates an economy. And, just looking at Ukraine, the sanctions with Ukraine right now, whether or not they're working, right, the intention is to be as effective as a missile, right, is to level that field. So we're working against tools that are not just, guns and bullets is the problem. So for me, I'm thinking of in finance, is there a way for me to make a war machine and push again, or to appropriate part of the war machine, right? Or to make one maybe and push against what the state is doing vis-a-vis finance? Or do we need to search outside of this? Do we need to make new relations, new kinship groups? Or do we need to reassess how we are as a community, right? In order to move forward? I think these are the questions that I am asking myself throughout this. How do we respond to capitalism and its politics and its ways of affecting our relationships, our social relations, our connection to things like to nature or to the machinic phylum, right? So I don't have an answer for you of how we can do this, but I think those questions are what we need to be asking. And I think it has to do with kinship and with relationships and how we establish communities, and something that Mark Fisher was trying to do perhaps in things of that nature. And maybe that requires a nomadology. Maybe we need to become like the Fremen in Dune and just there's something like that, right? Even they get appropriated by the House Atreides, the state, and get activated into a war machine whose object is jihad. So, even then, even that strong community is appropriated. So those are kind of questions are what I'm asking.
You've activated me. You mentioned Dune. I've got my Chris Arps Haderach t-shirt on. This right now.
I have so much to say about Dune.
This is the only part of Dune that is captured in the chapter. This is where they actually quote the idea of moving without rhythm from Children of Dune. But I'm gonna take myself because I think there's some other points I could do to build up into this. But I mean, I think it's very, of course, you're completely right about finance, especially today. I mean, finance is a kind of striated space, globally speaking, as particularly now because the weapons of war is turning off your access to the channels of capital circulation. Capital is only valid, it's taken as a valid sort of currency insofar as it is put through the proper channels. And insofar as those channels have all been sort of lifted, the walls have come down in terms of the channels at which capital can go through, through the sanctions of something like Visa or MasterCard. The space has, in a sense, been completely smoothed out. And think about it in the sense of a machinic phylum, just to unpack that term a little bit. It comes towards this very, not only Simondonian view of matter, but if I want to explain it in a more sort of elementary sense, the machinic phylum to me seems to be a conception of matter in which matter is held within fixed forms. There is form imprinted on matter, because they contrast the machinic phylum with something like the Aristotelian view, in which, for example, like a wax seal, a stamp, a form is impressed upon matter, and there's nothing in between; they're distinct entities. With this new view that there's an in-between in which the matter is becoming formed. The machinic phylum is essentially, you give an example of metallurgy, what you do is you melt something down into these incredibly hot, intense flows of matter, and they are becoming. You reduce something into a state of flow and becoming, and then you materially shape it as it becomes into a new form. And it's a way that links them both. So insofar as the war machine flattens out structures and apparatuses and the control structures and basically the walls of the channels of where things usually move within a state, within a controlled, ordered, organized area, it is reducing them to a state of raw becoming so that something can be made out of them. This is shown in the most egregious example of this in how this chapter has influenced the IDF. They take the idea of moving through walls and destriating space, because that's what they do. They reduce it to a space of chaos, and then they just construct their own order over it. This is why it's not such a case of good or bad, although I do think they do weigh themselves on the side of the nomads far more in this chapter, because much like in the rhizome chapter, we've had too much bloody, too many fucking trees. They're trying to generate a counter habit to the state. And I say the word habit because the state is not only a habitual mode of organizing places, and it's something we're used to. We're used to thinking about in terms of state thinking, in terms of a complete world transformation. Sometimes think is thought about in a way that someone like Slavoj Žižek thinks about it, where communism is now a kind of a global sovereign order. And he says this all the time. This isn't a critique of him. If it sounds like a critique, that's because if you say it like a critique and it is a critique, then it's a good Hegelian, we must accept it as a critique. But I guess one of the ways to start thinking about this is not only is the as a habit of political organization, but a habit of thinking about the political as such. And this is where we get to someone like Kant. Because Deleuze and Guattari is not the first guys to do this. Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, literally says, how am I going to destroy dogmatism? I'm going to recruit these skeptical nomads to dissolve all of their arguments, and then place the firm law of the critical tribunal of pure reason, which is models on the law of the Holy Roman Empire, to essentially do. He does want to appropriate the war machine, and the metaphor of war and the teaching of logistics is so central to what Kant is doing that you can see from how Deleuze and Guattari see Kant as their biggest enemy in many ways, that this is actually a project that is very much central to European philosophy. It's just now they're trying to make it as explicit as possible. But before I go on a long diatribe about Kant and the state, I'll let someone else speak.
I feel like this plateau is like the antidote to the kind of network Deleuzianism that we see coming out of like folks who have, let's just say, like more socially democratic political leanings, right? I feel like this is the one element that bites back against this idea of the BuzzFeed Deleuzianism, or Google Deleuzianism, as Alexander Galloway puts it, right? Because the one thing that we see like even in the attempt at co-opting the rhizomatic smooth space, like the rhizomatic and smooth versus striated space in, say, the pedagogy of the IDF for young officers and so on. At the same time, we realize that the one thing that these imperial forces cannot fundamentally apprehend for an extended period of time is a force whose primary drive is delinkage, right? Dispersion, dissolution. And that's why up against this utilization of Deleuze and Guattari, which sometimes gets treated as like the reason why, in fact, we must overturn rhizomatic thought, is the coming insurrection, right? Where the walls are supposed to break down to allow guerrillas to move in subversive spaces, to allow for these vacuoles of non-communication, these vacuoles of opposition to the state and state thinking too. Like, this is not just some sort of like field guide for military opposition, right? Although Deleuze and Guattari certainly always allude to this, right? There is a militaristic element to the notion of overcoding. There is an imperial kind of looming power that we see in the force of overcoding. But at the same time, what we find is that on the other end of this extreme, it's not a counter tendency, or it's not a counter molar opposition that Deleuze is calling for. He's not some sort of like Soviet figure who thinks that the answer is counter empire, but in fact, it's like that which is always on the verge of escaping that Deleuze wants us to valorize. And this is found even in the earliest elements of his thought. The reemergence of Hume in his earliest work, and the regurgitation of Humean habit, right, to talk about a counter habit, as a violence of thought that can overthrow state philosophy. But what he isn't calling for is, like we see in some texts, a counter empire. This is not some sort of new mode of organization. It's in fact the very possibility of that organization's dissipation.
I mean, one of the things that Deleuze specifically points out in the Nomad Thought essay is the idea that codification almost always takes the form of some kind of legalism or contractarianism. He's very explicit about this fact. And this is something that you can see in so many domains. When I was in education, for example, take a teacher who's fresh to the profession. Maybe they've gone to graduate school, maybe they have a master's, maybe they've done some interesting research on pedagogy, and they're bringing fresh techniques to the classroom that are more or less in line with their tendencies as a teacher. And as soon as these things get spotted by senior teachers or the administration, they want to bring them into an in-service or some sort of teaching workshop and render them in such a way that they are appropriable by educators of any kind. And I mean, this is just the way that the institution proceeds. You know, it's always kind of scouring the outside, to see what are the sort of novel innovations that can be used inside the classroom. Meanwhile, of course, the state's failing the schools the whole way. We're basically building poverty into cities and so forth. And so you're always fighting back against that. And no amount of novelty injected into our educational apparatus is ever going to offset that. And to be and remain a war machine always means, as you're saying, Will, is to embody this tendency towards a kind of slippage that gets us out of that contractarian mode, that gets us out of that legalistic mode. And I think the world that we live in, that legalism, surveillance, overcoding, oversight is so pervasive that I think the stakes have been fundamentally raised on the war machine of 2022. But
yeah, I just think that, like, for whether it's, Lapajati saying that at the root of Deleuze, if there is a root, right, is this force of aberrance, or Deleuze's desire for us to focus on the words of Foucault's preface to the second volume of History of Sexuality, which is, how does one think differently, right? Like, the theorist Deleuze always tries to remind us of, he only reminds us of them because he thinks they break us out of these contractarian modes of thought. Whether it is Lucretius in The Logic of Sense, Hume and Empiricism of Subjectivity, a very strange Nietzsche and Nietzsche in philosophy, or Foucault. These are theorists who have thought differently. I like to think of Lucretius when stuck. What's the difference with the human atom? The difference is, like, they're rather slippery. They move in a kind of strange way, right? I think that for him, it's always going to be an aleatory conception of thought predicated on sort of the violence of aberrance, of sort of breaking out or breaking down.
It's worth mentioning, too, that even Deleuze, in the essay that I'm talking about, doesn't hesitate to say that, what Nietzsche is suggesting is somewhat of a mystery. It can't be easily captured. It can't be represented because the very kind of movement that Nietzsche is instigating is one that's not easily subsumable to any kind of codification, remembrance. It's something that in its own embodiment or performance comes alive as new in the moment.
Y'all brought up a good point of what Deleuze is trying to do. My question was, like, are we going for, like, you pointed, like, are we going for some sort of counter empire here? Or are we trying to establish some new order that can, create this utopia? And so for me, it raises the question of, like, well, can I even use finance to do good? Right? How, if I do appropriate it, how do I know it won't end up devolving into what it's already become? And, that's the problem maybe with things like MMT, modern monetary theory, and how they approach spending and how they approach policying away poverty, perhaps, right? But it's still bound up in the elitists controlling and not allowing you to just, like, put your hand in Pandora's box and take out $1 trillion coin, right? And so is that actually a solution to anything? And also, are there things that we can't escape with finance? Maybe we can solve poverty, we can policy it away, but are there other issues, maybe of fascist nature, right, or of culture, of our relationship to commodities, even, right, that wouldn't be solved through a mechanism like finance if we used finance? So that was just a thought I had. Can I use finance in that way?
It would still be a crystallization of the nomadic for them, but I think this comes to one of the possible bad endings of rhizomatic thought, which is the hydraulic despotism. And I'm going to explain it with Dune because Dune is the best example of this. So you have a nomadic war machine that treats the territory in an entirely different way to the imperialist, very neo-feudalist forces of the Harkonnens and the Empire and all that. And then if we skip forward to God Emperor of Dune, I'm going to spoil it. I'm sorry, everybody. But
I want children of Dune.
Well, essentially, he becomes a hydraulic despot. Leto II becomes the one source of the sort of the living currency of the universe, which is spice. So if you have a hyper-centralized, it's not necessarily hierarchical in the sense that, this is one world against all the others, but it's a central channel. It's the river through which all of these different places can grow and have irrigation. Spice is like the water, because if you don't have it, and because everyone's addicted to it, they will die. And it is that there are chances of new despotisms to arise from this kind of nomadic thinking if it eventually crystallized itself into this sort of rhizomatic structure. But again, this is the point of the counter habit. There is a sort of demand for the new there. And I'm thinking in terms of their critique of representation, their critique of representation isn't that there are certain things that it's not that representation doesn't work, it's that it doesn't capture everything it aims to represent. Representation always composes a set of conditions of possibility onto something, the conditions under which we receive it, but we can actually receive things to such a high degree of intensity that there's actually always an excess of meaningfulness or an excess of directions, a kind of a swerve, almost like a Klineman in the sense of the Lucretian atoms, where they don't just all fall in a straight line, they have a slight sort of indeterminacy there, which you can follow, but you can't necessarily capture in advance of your own categories. And this is the kind of the excess which defines their critique of representation. There'll always be something more than what is meant within the fixity of representation that's either this or that. It's either caught in between two poles or two binaries of what it can be. So critique of representation is always going to be looking for that excess or finding it as a sort of demonstrable excess that kind of metamorphosizes what we're saying as soon as we've finished saying it. And this is going to be the case with Kant. Kant has to posit the excess and then cut ourselves off from it in order to have representations. And the way he does this, in many ways, by linking everything back to not only the condition of experience, but that which justifies their claim over experience, which is that they are all limited to the transcendental, what he calls the transcendental unity of apperception. Now, this is the I think. This is the cogito from Descartes. I think must be able to accompany all my representations, and it's the I think that lays down the laws of experience, that legislates over nature, and sort of unifies all of the functions and faculties of my mind into the legislator, which is the transcendental unity of apperception, which isn't actually my subjectivity, but just a formal condition of it, and the various ways under which this unity holds together all of the different faculties of judgment, of predication, of proposition, of structuring the laws of thought and what can be thought and what can be experienced insofar as it can be thought. And finally, this transcendental unity of apperception is provided in the transcendental deductions in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Now, a deduction is not a logical deduction in the typical way we think of it. It's actually a legal kind of deduction that goes back to the days of the Roman Empire in which Kant was operating. And deductions were actually ways of proving your genealogical claim to inheritance over a property, over the dominion in which you can order a property according to your own laws. These deductions, they are actually manuals of deductions that were handed out by the state to help competing city-states, free states, or states within the Roman Empire who are constantly competing with each other, because it was quite a loose, I don't want to say confederacy, because that was what came after it, the Confederation of the Rhinelands and Napoleon. But fundamentally, this habit of state thinking, or this habit of legislative thinking, the habit of splitting things up into what can be represented according to certain laws of thought that are given in the framing of the sovereignty of a transcendental unity, not only of the I think, but of the unity of any system whatsoever, that is divided into legislator and legislated, subject and sovereign, is going to be the state apparatus for Deleuze and Guattari, as well as the very habits of state thinking, even going into the most rudimentary epistemological ways we think about representation. Without the unity of experience, the guaranteeing, identifying unity of the I think, we have what Hume has, which is there is a field in which experience happens, and some of it is grasped and taken into this bundle that we call ourselves habitually, and some of it isn't. There's a competition about what forces want to be grasped into this bundle of things that we are, and the field of experience becomes a contest. And Kant acknowledges this very much. He says that Hume broke him up from his dogmatic slumbers, and that's why he's going to take the nomadic forces of skepticism, destroy all of the dogmatic, particularly scholastic forms of philosophy, as well as a fucking lot of Leibniz, I'll say that, and re-establish the rule of law under the sovereign unity under which all things can be represented as experienceable and as subject to judgment. And if it doesn't fit in with that, you've got to leave it behind. And he says you have to be disciplined into not doing that. Kant is the essential state functionary, and representation. It's not saying that I can't be represented. It's like, no, we can all be expressed in language, but there's always going to be an excessive point, and it's even in expressing the excess, it will rattle a few sort of Lacanian feathers or so, but that's because their job is to try and put that back into various boxes. But even in late Lacan's life, he knew it was kind of out of it.
a way that I could summarize that briefly is to say that the representational form of thinking, the image of thought as it pertains to the state, doesn't tolerate ambiguity very well. And I can pose this as a question for Noah too. I think one of the challenges of finance, I mean, of course, is the value form, and maybe more broadly construed, value. Because what do we mean by value? We mean something that's measurable. We also mean something that can be judged. And the way that I see it is, what happens is when you have this pervasive sense of value imposed upon people, producing the kinds of, institutions and mechanisms that basically fuse the socius to a sense of infinite obligation to the state, whether it's in the form of paying taxes, paying rents, and what have you. How can a form of life emerge that valorizes or at least allows for a high level of ambiguity at many levels?
Yeah, well, it's actually pairs perfectly with what Lazzarato is talking about with governmentality, I think, and this sort of feedback loop, as you said, of people feeling obligated to work within the state, or to do things like that enable the state on a micro level. And your question of what is value is very salient too. I mean, Marx has a lot to say on things like his takes on money, which might be wrong, and versus other takes on money like modern monetary theory, which may be true, but they don't have a politics there. And so, for me, when I'm thinking of lines of flight out of whatever this is, I'm trying to think of how we are going to approach value, like you said, like what, not even in a purely economic term, and that's a whole can of worms, right? But also, how do we reorient ourselves, ontologically, existentially? This is like, right? It's because this governmentality of us feedback looping the system of this microfascism, maybe, that enables all of this. Is how do we escape that? And is there something to do with nomadology here that we can use to escape it? Do we need to make different spaces? Is that via online or in person? How do we make new communities? How do we become a group of nomads that can move past the striations that finance sets up for us? Again, I don't have the answer, but that this is the way that you have to take it, is that there's something to do with our relationships and the kinship network of the nomads and how they interacted with other networks, and what even the purpose of war was. It was to break up flows of money and energy. It was to disrupt structures that were getting too powerful.
Will, as someone who I imagine is repellent to the idea of finance, I'm interested to hear your response to that.
Yeah, I think the problem is governmentality, right? Like, I don't even know if like breaking down the question of like value is even like sufficient enough to like, is it even a sufficient enough precondition for like, let's just say like capital L liberation or something like that, right? Yeah, I'm quite repellent to notions of like rogue finance and things like that. I don't think Bitcoin must be defended. Like I for me, like this is just the absolute epitome of like uncreativity. But like at the same time, too, like I think that these questions about the flow of capital and understanding the way in which these networks of commodity production and dispersion is really important, right? Like a friend of mine tweeted, you want to do this, block a port. You want to achieve that, block a port. It comes down to questions of disrupting circulation and how best to do that. To me, that necessitates an understanding of the very technocracy you rub up against, right? And Deleuze and Guattari talk about this, right? They have an extended engagement with Keynes and Anti-Oedipus, right? Not because they're Keynesians, but because Keynes allows them to understand the way in which the concept of value production changed in the interwar and post-war period. So I think that while I am absolutely apprehensive and not hugely on board with notions of rogue finance, I think the understanding that comes with an intimate engagement with financial sciences, I guess would be one way to put it, is helpful. As is, like, it's helpful to understand human resources in order to get a grasp of like what post-docility politics looks like, what the control society looks like. Because there's nothing worse than an empty polemics with no fundamental grasp of the monster that you're dealing with. So I think that when it comes to these questions, we do have to be at least a little bit educated. But at the same time, not fall into, again, what Alexander Galloway calls an awesomeology, right? Where the network you've built is so amazing and so broad that in fact you just replicate the system out of a hatred that becomes a reverence for it. So that would be my one point of opposition, where it's like, oh, like network theory to oppose a system that is already predicated on network theory is, for me, just conceding to defeat.
See, I quite like the idea of rogue finance purely for Dune reasons, because I was just thinking in terms of like the spice as the essential currency of the universe. And so if you find any system, you find its spice, and then essentially whatever taps you need to turn off to have it by the bollocks. I mean, this is sort of the active principal currency, even if it's not sort of monetarily speaking. In terms of a system of destructive flows, where if it turns off, it really fucking turns off. I think we've kind of, ever since 2008, if not going back to the 20s, we've seen as a certain lever that can put a squeeze on things, or particularly a disruption of the spell. But I kind of think, if you find the spice of any given imperial structure and know where to sort of deactivate zones of control over its main channels, you could do. I mean, Andreas Malm's book, how to blow up a pre-spice mound is actually quite good on this.
It also takes us back to it also takes us back to Comrade Evergreen, when it was stuck in the Suez Canal and was just costing the world billions of dollars day by day by blocking those flows. But Noah, did you have something? It looks like you were going to speak up.
This notion of rogue finance is really tough, right? And I don't think Bitcoin is an answer. It's just like a technocratic libertarian stream. And it's not really doing anything to destabilize economic relationships necessarily. Like, are you going to try to out asset inflate your assets versus the elite's assets, right? Like, how possible is that?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's the question of capacity for violence too. It's like the same disposition that some folks have when it comes to like possibilities of like militant organizing to oppose the state, right? Like, you're never gonna see the kind of confluence of forces that like a state can gather, right? But I think the problem with like rogue finance is so much deeper than just a question of like a question of force. For me, it's much more a question of opposing the very axiomatic, right? And Deleuze and Guattari get into this in the plateau that follows on the apparatus of capture, where they say like a politics of becoming minority, or a politics of minoritarianism, like a minoritarian position, has to be one whose very foundation is in opposition to the overwhelming axiomatic of the system that they oppose, not just simply an action here or there that can depose like leadership or cut off the head of any given subject. It has to be a movement that challenges, I think the word that they use is the worldwide axiomatic. For example, and Tikkun talks about this quite a bit too, it's like, no doubt, like this figure of the mind, like of the revolutionary minority can possibly find its universal consciousness in the proletariat, but so long as the working class acquires its status through being conquered by, or always being conquered by, the state, it appears already as like on the plane of capital. So it has to be an opposition or a line of flight away from that plane. So that's my fear about rogue finance, is that it's not an opposition to the very axiomatic. It's just simply like an opposing force that leads to the same result. Because again, as Craig said, this one fundamentally doesn't leave the question, like it leaves the question of value production aside.
I have one question about here's one challenge, I guess. So given that for Deleuze and Guattari, the state is a kind of habit of our thinking as well as a habit of organization, and a habit of our subjectivity, and not only how we treat our own subjectivity in terms of the subject itself divided between sort of a higher faculty of legislating and a faculty that obeys itself in a Kantian way. So, you obey yourself when you obey the laws of your reason, because it's your reason, it's your unified subjectivity, the thing that makes it unifies, that gives you the formal conditions of being you. Insofar as the state, or as they call it, the Urstaat, because they think there has always been a state, quite perfect, because it is the habitual mode of like, I think, or I thinking, which is the mode of thinking in terms of unity. Insofar as they're proposing a counter-habit in the form of nomadism, or revealing a counter-habit that the state relies upon to expand itself and create new things from the conquest of territories. Do you think there's a possibility for them to fully habituate a new kind of thinking, a new kind of affect that is non-state based? Or do you think there's always going to be they're trying to provide a kind of circuit breaker to state thinking in a way that, that essentially every so often we would have to have a nomadic insurrection to make a new state for ourselves, or a new sort of social thing, which can in fact build up into a state formation, but we need to emphasize these nomadic forces so that they don't ossify in the same way or hang over us in a way it isn't necessarily benefit. Because there are some benefits of living in some sort of state societies, I think they would say, as opposed to, but it's quite a rough and tumble sort of thing with the nomads. But are they sort of proposing almost a circuit breaker insurrection every now and then, a circuit breaker civil war? I mean, sort of how we would answer this question in turn. If the state is a habit and the nomadology is a counter-habit formation, does the counter-habit always rely on the presence of that which it is countering? Or will this be the new Earth?
Well, I think the answer for Deleuze is like so much earlier in his corpus, right? Like in Empiricism and Subjectivity, Deleuze is very clear that like habit for Hume, and I think even for like figures like Bergson and others, like habit's not like some natural given, right? Any given habit is not a natural given. And in fact, the way habit must be used is as an epistemological technique to recognize any given habit, right? It's a recognitive sort of tool. And then of course, like Foucault will use habit to also say that like habit, the way in which the state apprehends habit later is that like habit becomes something that must be instilled. So like, I don't think it's a question of like habit, counter habit, but instead like a conspiratorial destituent communism, like a perpetual proliferation of civil war, right? It's not just this evocation of opposing forces, because the opposing forces are there, right, if we are good Nietzsche.
And I think this is part of the very problematic that Deleuze lays out, Deleuze and Guattari lay out in Anti-Oedipus, and that Deleuze lays out in this Nomad Thought essay, which is it's not going to be negatively defined or defined subordinately to the habit of the state. And I think just the idea of recognition, the connection between recognition and habit, also poses the problem of what a nomadology could be, because there's something spontaneous about it. There's something aleatory about it. It's not something that's easily recognizable. It's not something that's easily fit into a mold, politically speaking. It's something that in its actuation is lived and experienced. If there is something to be developed in the vein of articulating, like, what is the epistemology of habit, vis-a-vis the state and the war machine? Well, I think it comes down to something that we see in the middle of the Nomadology chapter, which is identifying the difference between changes in movement and changes in speed. Basically, how do we alter the extensity of any given political milieu, and how do we alter or disrupt its intensities? In the reading group, I had my example of how slasher films are a good way of thinking about the way that nomadic speed occurs. For example, like we said, you can replace leaders. You can elect a more socially democratic congressperson, or you can get on the Bernie bro train or whatever. And look, let's face it, there could be modest changes that effectuate an important shift in an individual or community's political life. But when we think about the broader stakes, how is it that another form of life could emerge in the face of political oppression? Well, I think that goes back exactly to what Will was saying, which is we must find a way to either shut down or, take a line of flight away from the dominant axiom, which in our society is capital and governmentality and so forth, right? It's going to happen on the exterior somewhere. And then the challenge is finding a way to follow that line to the point where you don't blow apart in the end or fall into the hands of the state, go to jail or something like that. How can you live on the outside without the inside pulling you back in? That's one of the questions that I think is constantly asked of us in this text.
I think one thing that is really cool about what you're saying here is when it comes to this not blowing apart in the process, this is when you start to see Deleuze and Guattari as formulating a philosophy of strategy and tactics and the relationship between those two. So maybe one conversation that would be interesting, one day to follow up on would be Deleuze and Guattari as like posing different models of the relationship between overall strategy and individual particular tactics too.
This is why civil war was probably such a fascinating paradigm that's developed by people like de Kuhn, because insofar as we do have these habitual state orientations, any sort of nomadic affect will end up being an affect of civil war, and the proliferation of a form of life which isn't, which is contrary to that habit or not defined in advance by the limits of that habit. And this is why I like someone like Max Stirner, because insofar as he also treats the realm of affect and the realm of thought as equally something that's produced and equally something that has power over individuals and how they conduct themselves or how they see their own endeavors in life as being conducted, how sort of the autonomy can become a kind of involuntary servitude, because the problem with autonomy is that you have to, you make your own laws, but then you've got to follow them. And because there is a kind of active civil war in someone like Stirner's own head. Of course, he wasn't as sensitive to the financial concerns, and that's why he ended up in debtor's prison about 3 or 4 times. But I think we can definitely find a model of an internal insurgency, and maybe sort of this nomadic affect would be an affect of the proliferation of a habitual affective activity of disruption or breaking down the bonds of capital subjectivation, both internally and externally. How to do that? Firstly, it's a consciousness raising thing, and secondly, it's a very, parody thing, I'll say. I mean, you have to remember, because Guattari later went on to write Communists Like Us. This is eventually going to have particularly insurgent or revolutionary implications in terms of what they want to get out of this.
Or not.
Yeah.
Guattari was also somewhat optimistic about finance, at least to a degree.
Hence why I said or not.
That's right. Well, we're at about the hour mark. Maybe one of the ways that we can wrap up is just talk about like big takeaway either from today's conversation or from the Nomadology plateau in general as we move in the reading group to read Apparatus of Capture. And if you aren't a member of that reading group, if you aren't a member of our reading group, please join us on Patreon. We will be reading together at the end of April. But maybe we'll start with Noah. What's the sort of like the big gem that you have robbed from this plateau?
For me, it was super fun to pair this reading with my anthropological and historical research under the origins of states and monetary systems, of anti-state societies, of kinship groups, of violence, of the finances, violence. It paired perfectly well. And I think that the war machine as a concept and nomadology as a concept is pretty important to understand how those apparatuses work, right? And I'm reading a lot of Colin Drum's work. I would really recommend looking into his dissertation, The Difference That Money Makes, which kind of goes into talking about this movement of money into the creation from the sovereign king to the indebted government, the indebted subservient state that's subservient to capitalism, right? And Dune, of course, I'm reading that, and Dune is an amazing example of a war machine. There's the war machine that is the Fremen. There's the state that are the Atreides. There's the magician king that is Paul. There's the jurist priests that is the Bene Gesserit's kind of planting the seeds of Paul's coming, and then Jessica, and then Aaliyah later on becoming sort of this priestly division, right? And so all of these things I happen to be reading right now are going really well together with reading The War Machine. And so it's been a lot of fun talking about it with y'all, and doing the reading group. I couldn't have done it alone, and I think stuff like this is super helpful for me just to talk up. If I can say something, then I can more easily know if it's right or wrong, and then get things bouncing back from y'all. So this has always been a great time. Yeah.
Will, what about you?
I think I'm going to talk about rather than a gem I took away, I think I'm going to talk about a gem I was robbed of. I really wish I was at this reading group, because it seems like I missed like a ton of really cool discussion, because I feel like these plateaus are sort of like a force of violence that allows you to sort of take a different stance than you're used to. Like it almost feels as though like all of the different things, like we've just been talking about like 15 different possibilities and ways in which we can connect like flight to intensity to motion, and like Yeah, so I think my takeaway is precisely what I was robbed of. I wish I was at this reading group. That's my takeaway.
Well, the problem is you're at the emo concert doing windmills and karate kicks in the pit. But that's a kind of nomadology, I imagine.
Yeah, like I'm here with a black eye, actually, from a...
Just drink your Arizona tea. All right. Adam, what about you?
Well, I mean, in terms of the rhizomatics of genre of music that we talked about in the Rhizome episode, I mean, mosh pits are a nomadic war machine, and of course they get overcoded into the fascism that is black metal. So, less said about that, the better. But I really love reading this, and discussing with everyone, particularly getting some of the stuff that I really didn't get in the slightest about metallurgy and the particular anthropological aspects of this, which really isn't sort of my field. I mean, what I did love about this was, as well, just in sort of my particular theoretical interest, was this text is actually really good for understanding Kant. It's really good for understanding Kant's particular pure reason, how Kant thinks about the state, as well as how he uses the term nomadology, how category thinking works, how the state and how transcendental idealism works on the basis of a kind of epigenetics of habit. And I did actually write, I mean, you make a link, I wrote something about this and the state as a kind of transcendental habit, which is quite a theoretical problem, really, thinking about non-state societies. How do we counter the habit of the particularly restrictive mode of self-differentiation of I thinking, which is, of course, a very big problem for me as a guy who's doing Stirner, who is all about the I and the mind, and how do we think about the I and the mind in a more expansive way than this very restrictive dividing into legislature and legislative version of autonomy, where it's just actually you're replacing the rule of one with the rule of the same rule you've had all the time. I actually translated something on this internal rule thing today for Stirner, but this is a really sort of, this text is really going to frame a lot of what I'm doing going forward, especially in counter people's work like Saul Newman. He's got a really good paper on Deleuze and Stirner on the critique of the state through the war machine. There's a lot of rich stuff here. It's huge. It's a huge fucking plateau, and I think it's probably one of the richest ones that is. It's both overrated in terms of its very destructive, accelerationist, Dune-inflected aesthetics, but also one of the most rich in terms of you can get something new out of this thing every time.
I don't think I have something amazing to end with, but I'm just looking over my notes. I think the one thing that I'll take away and something worth looking at again is this idea of a war machine or a nomadism embodying this kind of vortical or vortex-like movement, as opposed to a kind of overcoding, like Adam was saying earlier, here comes the stamp onto the wax seal, whereas the speed, as it were, the kind of intensity that the nomad assemblage has is one in which its ethics, its politics, actuated or actualized in its own event, in its own becomings.